Devereaux Storm grew up surrounded by luxury and the unspoken tension that came with being the heir to one of the largest fortunes on the East Coast. His father, Hendrik Storm, was a business magnate who had inherited a sprawling corporate empire and multiplied it tenfold, branching into real estate, tech investments, and international trade. From a young age, Devereaux watched the ebb and flow of lavish parties and hushed boardroom deals, noticing how everyone around him valued power and profit above all else. Even affection in the Storm household felt curated and clinical, as though any display of warmth was just another calculated move. His mother, Fleur Storm, was a graceful socialite who threw extravagant charity galas, all while enduring her husband's continuous infidelities. Devereaux saw how, beneath her poised smile, she was often exhausted or quietly distressed. In public, she remained flawless, arm in arm with Hendrix for photographs in glossy magazines. Behind closed doors, it was a different story. Devereaux overheard snippets of heated arguments that ended in icy silences. In time, he realized their marriage was a polite facade for preserving reputation and, more importantly, the Storm legacy. As a teenager, Devereaux internalized this grim lesson: love was just another negotiation. He watched his father's pattern of betrayal, his mother's complicit tolerance, and the artificial displays of unity that fooled no one who looked closely. Gradually, he formed a personal creed, an unbreakable vow: never let emotion take precedence over logic, never marry for something as fleeting as affection, and never allow a woman to dismantle his guard. Love, he believed, was a weakness that cost too much. By his 29th birthday, Devereaux had already seized the helm of Storm and Company, a multinational conglomerate of staggering reach. In business circles, he was known for his razor-sharp decisions and uncanny ability to revive failing ventures. Deal after deal, he proved himself worthy of the Storm name, though many whispered that his tactics were as cold as the steel towers that bore his family's name. Tabloids loved to chronicle his glamorous dates, stunning supermodels, accomplished actresses, and influential heiresses. Yet none lingered in his life for more than a handful of months. Some called him a romantic drifter, but anyone truly close to him knew better. Devereaux Storm did not drift so much as he fled. When a partner asked for anything beyond superficial attachment, he politely and swiftly ended the affair. Feelings, in his view, only complicated the clarity required to maintain wealth and power. Society columns spun countless rumors. Some said Devereaux was simply too jaded by his parents' toxic marriage, others speculated there must have been a heartbreak in his past that hardened him for good. The truth, however, was carved into his own silent promise: he would never let himself be vulnerable to the pain he had witnessed growing up. Despite his chill reputation, people scrambled for his attention: business proposals, investment pitches, philanthropic causes. Storm and Company had a global presence, and everyone wanted a piece of its resources. Devereaux navigated these demands with practiced calm. He had no time for trifling matters. He delegated, closed deals, and meticulously guarded his emotions. To the world, he presented the unassailable image of a man who needed no one and trusted only in strategy. Yet fate has a way of testing the strongest walls. By the time Devereaux crossed paths with a woman who neither feared his billions nor yearned for them, the quiet fortress he had built around his heart would begin to show signs of fracture. In the realm of corporate takeovers and cutthroat negotiations, it was an unexpected twist, a challenge to the very vow that had once given him a sense of control and certainty. But in those early days, he had no inkling of just how drastically his life would change or how unprepared he truly was to face a love he had sworn to deny. Evangeline Carter, known to friends and family as Evie, had grown up far from the glittering skyline of Manhattan. She was raised in a small coastal town called Seabright, where mornings began with the smell of sea salt and evenings ended with the quiet hum of porch conversations. Her parents owned a modest cafe that served fresh baked goods and coffee to the locals, a spot that filled her heart with warmth whenever she needed a reminder of home. From an early age, Evie discovered a passion for design, spending her free hours sketching rooms she dreamed of transforming. While her peers obsessed over pop stars and weekend parties, she scoured architecture magazines and watched online tutorials on how to create elegant, livable spaces. After graduating from a modest arts program, Evie took the bold step of establishing her own design studio, Carter's Interiors, in a cramped second-floor office overlooking Seabright's Main Street. It was hardly the luxurious kind of location she might have preferred, but she put her soul into every project, whether it was choosing wallpaper for a local bakery or consulting on a friend's living room remodel. Bit by bit, her name began circulating among small-town business owners impressed by her flair for blending functionality with subtle beauty. She learned how to handle pressure when budgets were tight and clients wavered on decisions, and she developed a knack for listening, really listening, to people's needs rather than imposing her own visions. It was a chance meeting at a regional design convention that altered her trajectory. A prominent architecture firm spotted her portfolio and extended an invitation. Would she be interested in bidding on a major interior rebranding for a corporate client in New York? The firm made it sound like the opportunity of a lifetime, substantial budget, creative freedom, and a chance to break into the big leagues. Evie's nerves nearly overwhelmed her, but something in her refused to let the chance pass. She packed her sketches and digital mood boards, threw caution to the wind, and hopped on a train to Manhattan. There, she found herself staring up at a towering glass building owned by Storm & Company. It was a name she recognized vaguely from finance news, though she had no idea who truly stood at the company's helm, nor did she suspect the man behind the empire was so famously detached from anything resembling personal attachment. The day of her first meeting was a whirlwind. She was ushered into a reception area framed by polished marble and gleaming metal accents, an environment that felt both daunting and exhilarating. Nervously juggling her presentation materials, Evie stepped into an elevator stuffed with professional-looking executives checking their phones. When the doors slid shut and the elevator ascended, she tried to refocus on her notes, barely noticing the tall man in an impeccably tailored suit who entered just before the doors closed. The moment the elevator jolted to a stop, she lost her balance and stumbled backward, inadvertently planting her heel on this stranger's polished leather shoes. She spun around, mortified, stammering apologies. His gaze, a piercing gray, flickered over her with cool assessment. He said nothing at first, just gave a curt nod as if dismissing the matter. The elevator opened onto the executive floor, and as she stepped out, red-faced and muttering a final, "I'm so sorry," she glimpsed the faintest narrowing of his eyes. She had no inkling that this poised, inscrutable man was none other than Devereaux Storm himself, a figure whose very name made headlines in the business world. Evie's cheeks still burned as she navigated the maze of corridors, eventually finding the correct conference room for her presentation. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that her clumsy encounter wasn't over, as if the electricity in the air had only just begun to surge. When her contact from the architecture firm introduced her to the project team, Evie laid out her design concepts, her voice trembling at first. She explained how she envisioned weaving elements of sleek modernism with subtle organic textures to soften the corporate edge. While most of the board members listened politely, a familiar presence lingered by the large windows overlooking the city. It was the same man from the elevator. He wore the same stoic expression, arms folded, face impassive. Only now did someone mention his name, Storm, the CEO. Her heart hammered in her ears as she realized she was standing mere feet from one of the wealthiest, most enigmatic men in Manhattan, and that she had literally stepped on him minutes earlier. Yet instead of dismantling her confidence, the revelation sparked a wave of determination. She stood straighter, pitched her ideas with renewed clarity, and refused to let his cool, near-surgical gaze fluster her. By the time her slides concluded, an understated hush fell over the room. To her astonishment, Devereaux Storm inclined his head in quiet approval. He spoke just one sentence, "We'll review the budget and proceed," and then exited, leaving the rest of the team to discuss details. The encounter was so swift that it felt surreal, but it planted an unshakable curiosity in Evie. There was something almost mythic about the man, a subtle sense of detachment that both intrigued and unsettled her. She had no idea how deeply that curiosity would pull her into his world, or how her earnest heart would soon clash with his unyielding vow to never again be swayed by love. Over the next several days, Evangeline found herself juggling design proposals and schedules far more intense than anything she had handled back in Seabright. Each morning, she arrived at the Soaring Storm and Company headquarters armed with swatches, sketches, and a neatly organized presentation deck on her tablet. Although she'd been hired for a single corporate rebranding project, the scope quickly expanded once the executives saw her enthusiasm and unique approach. They wanted her to develop concepts for multiple floors, each reflecting a sleek, contemporary style yet subtly nodding to Storm and Company's storied history. On her second day in the building, Evie ran into Devereaux Storm again, not quite as clumsily as their first encounter, but just as unexpectedly. She was studying a blueprint near the reception desk, hoping to confirm dimensions for new furniture, when she sensed a presence at her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with the CEO, his silver-gray eyes scanning her blueprint as though it were a crucial contract. He didn't apologize for hovering, nor did he smile. He simply said, "You plan on updating the entire reception area?" That was not part of the original pitch. She took a moment to gather her composure, then explained that she believed the reception floor should serve as a statement piece, welcoming clients with a design that communicated Storm and Company's balance of innovation and legacy. To her relief, Devereaux nodded once in approval. He stepped aside, allowing her access to the elevator, and followed her in. The short ride passed in a hush, broken only by the hum of the machinery and the tension she felt standing next to him. By the time they reached her floor, her heart was hammering an anxious beat, though she tried to hide it behind a cool professional demeanor. Their work interactions continued in a similar pattern, formal, succinct, yet inexplicably charged. Devereaux rarely wasted words during design reviews. If he liked something, he granted a brisk nod. If he disapproved, his question would cut straight to the flaw, forcing Evie to defend or refine her decisions on the spot. More than once, she felt her frustration rise at his unyielding standards. She was accustomed to clients who asked for her creative vision and then followed her lead. Devereaux Storm was different. He wanted a say in every material choice and color combination. On one occasion, he even requested that she swap out her beloved teal accents for a shade of deep charcoal, arguing it captured the essence of the company's understated sophistication. She thought it sounded dreary, but he possessed a surprisingly keen eye. Through all this, Evie took note of his habit of keeping personal matters off the table. Whenever conversation nudged into anything resembling small talk, he redirected it. If a junior executive joked about weekend plans, Devereaux barely acknowledged them. During brainstorming sessions, he never once revealed anything about his own tastes or passions beyond the corporate realm. Yet there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when she sensed deeper currents beneath his polished exterior. A hint of restlessness flared in his eyes whenever staff members tried too hard to impress him. His jaw tightened slightly whenever she mentioned family-run businesses or personal anecdotes from her life in Seabright. As if any reference to genuine, personal connection irritated him. One evening, well past normal working hours, Evie stayed behind to finalize the color palettes for the top-floor executive suites. With a tight deadline looming, she needed every spare minute. The office lights had dimmed to a nighttime glow, leaving only the murmur of air vents and the distant hum of city traffic outside the windows. While rummaging through her bag for a pen, she heard footsteps approach. Her pulse flickered in recognition before she even looked up. Devereaux Storm stood near the doorway, tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone, an uncharacteristic departure from his usual impeccable formality. "I thought everyone had left," she said, trying to sound casual as her heart did a small leap of surprise. "I rarely leave this early," he replied, leaning a shoulder against the doorframe. His gaze flicked to the array of sample boards spread across the table. "Finishing the top-floor design." She nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the clutter of paint chips and fabric swatches. "Yes, I'm narrowing down final materials for curtains and carpet." I didn't expect the suite to be so expansive. It's more like a luxury penthouse than an office. Are you sure you need all that space for business? A faint shadow passed across his face. That floor used to host private client receptions and events my father thought crucial for corporate diplomacy. I've always found it excessive. Evie heard the faint distaste in his tone and dared to ask, then why keep it at all? For a moment, he seemed to weigh how much he wanted to disclose. Storm and Company has a certain image. My father believes in these lavish displays of power. Part of the company culture, I suppose. He trailed off, and an awkward silence ensued. Normally, Evie tried to leave personal topics alone. She was here to do a job, not to pry into the CEO's psyche. Yet she sensed a thread of earnestness in his demeanor, a subtle sadness under the cynicism. Well, she ventured carefully, if it helps, I'm aiming for a design that's impressive but also warm, so people feel comfortable. Maybe we can show them that power doesn't have to be cold. She caught his slight recoil, as if the word warm made him wary. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. You've done well so far. Keep going. His approval, though clipped, felt significant. He turned to go, but paused in the hallway. He glanced back, expression impossible to read. By the way, the board wants to see a preliminary budget breakdown next week. Don't let them corner you on cost. I'll handle the final negotiations. It was as close to an offer of protection as she had received from him, an acknowledgement that she wasn't used to playing in a field of million-dollar line items and cutthroat executives. Before she could thank him, he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing down the deserted corridor. In the days that followed, Evie's impression of Devereaux Storm only grew more complex. She caught glimpses of quiet generosity. An employee mentioned offhand that he donated large sums to employee scholarship funds under anonymous designations. Yet she also noticed his unshakable walls. No matter the topic, Devereaux maintained a careful distance, as if intimacy of any kind threatened his carefully ordered world. At night, alone in her rented apartment overlooking the city lights, Evie couldn't stop replaying their interactions in her mind. She felt drawn to the puzzle of him, the commanding businessman with a guarded heart. Why did he keep himself so isolated? Could he really be as immune to human connection as the rumors suggested? She reminded herself that she was here to deliver a design, not unravel the enigma of Devereaux Storm. Still, curiosity tugged at her every time she saw a flash of weariness in his gaze. One afternoon, the design review ran over schedule, and by the time Evie left the building, rain was pelting the sidewalks. Juggling her folders, she struggled to open her flimsy umbrella. Then, without warning, someone stepped into the downpour beside her. She glanced over to see Devereaux, impeccably composed despite the weather. His driver was pulling up the sleek black company car to the curb. To her surprise, he angled his own dark umbrella so it covered them both. "Come on," he said, not offering an explanation, simply tilting his head toward the vehicle. "You'll ruin your sketches." Gratitude and confusion swirled in her chest. She let him guide her to the car, her shoes squelching against the wet pavement. For a moment, she felt the press of his shoulder and a soft swirl of his cologne, the combination sending an unsteady warmth through her. When they were both inside, he handed her a spare towel from the back seat, maintaining his usual calm reserve. "Thank you," she managed, squeezing water from her hair. Devereaux nodded, staring ahead as the car merged into traffic. "It's just practicality. No sense letting valuable designs get soaked." Evie wanted to laugh at the half-hearted excuse, but instead she just murmured her appreciation. The ride to her apartment building was silent, but in that hush, she found her pulse quickening at the realization that somewhere beneath his stoic exterior, he possessed a quiet kindness he refused to openly acknowledge. After dropping her off, he offered no farewell beyond a polite nod, and the car swept back into the city's bustle. Standing in the lobby, watching the red taillights vanish, Evie wondered how deep his courtesy ran, and what walls she might inevitably crash against if she tried to learn more about him. For now, she consoled herself with the knowledge that work kept bringing them together, that each new phase of the project demanded more interaction. She told herself it was purely professional. Yet a small voice in her mind asked a more unsettling question: if it was truly only about design reviews and invoices, why did her heart flutter each time he appeared by her side? Over the following week, Evie found herself increasingly entangled in the daily pulse of Storm and Company. At first, she believed her role would remain firmly in the design realm, selecting elegant textures, finalizing color palettes, and meeting the unspoken demands of a man whose standards seemed nearly impossible to satisfy. Yet the deeper she ventured into the project, the more she realized how often Devereaux Storm's personal choices, or the absence thereof, shaped the company's ambience. One gray afternoon, she was summoned to a high-level meeting alongside a few senior executives. They wanted her perspective on merging a newly acquired subsidiary's branding into the broader Storm and Company aesthetic. She sat at the long, polished table, her design boards propped up behind her chair, feeling like an outlier in a room dominated by men in tailored suits. Devereaux entered last, his presence immediately filling the space with a low hum of anticipation. He took his seat at the head of the table, nodding once to acknowledge her. The meeting unfolded with a brisk efficiency that was pure Devereaux: short questions, decisive feedback, minimal small talk. Amid a discussion about cost projections, Evie dared to voice a suggestion about continuity. The newly acquired subsidiary had a reputation for warm, community-based interactions, something that could soften Storm and Company's sometimes imposing image. She expected immediate pushback, but Devereaux simply turned his gaze on the CFO, who had been mumbling about expense ledgers. In that silent moment, Evie felt the entire room hold its breath. Then, with cool finality, Devereaux approved her idea. A wave of startled glances passed among the executives, as if they couldn't recall the last time someone had introduced a more humane edge, and he had accepted it without argument. When the meeting ended, everyone filed out, but Devereaux lingered. He approached where Evie was packing up her boards. The hush of the conference room weighed on her, reminding her of the times they'd been alone in the deserted halls after hours. She wasn't sure what she expected, maybe a compliment, or a private critique, but he simply said, "Your proposal was practical and forward-thinking. Keep pushing for it. I'll handle the financial side." The crispness in his tone betrayed no emotion, yet she detected an undercurrent of respect that hadn't been there before. Soon after, rumors began circulating about a charity gala Storm and Company was hosting to spotlight their philanthropic arm. Evie heard colleagues whisper that the event would be a lavish affair designed to bolster the company's public image. It wasn't her responsibility, normally such things fell under corporate PR, but to her surprise, an email arrived requesting her assistance with the event's thematic styling. Apparently Devereaux believed the interior redesign of the gala venue should complement the new direction she was bringing to the headquarters. Evie read the message twice, suspecting the impetus had to come from him. Why else would the PR department specifically request her input on a single-night occasion? So, that same week, she found herself standing in the grand ballroom of an upscale hotel, mentally rearranging furniture, picturing how custom lighting could transform the cavernous space into something more inviting. She was in the midst of jotting notes when footsteps echoed behind her. Turning, she spotted Devereaux once again, this time in a charcoal suit that accentuated his lean frame. There was a hint of impatience in his posture, as though he had just stepped out of another demanding meeting. She cleared her throat, offering a polite smile. "I heard you wanted me to handle the aesthetic for the gala," she asked, unsure if it was he who truly wanted it or if it was simply corporate protocol. He nodded. "We can't afford any public missteps right now. My father is pushing for an aggressive acquisition strategy, and all eyes are on Storm and Company. I want this event to convey a message of stability and understated confidence." Evie studied him for a moment, catching the subtle tension in his voice. This mention of his father seemed to darken his usually stoic expression. She had gleaned bits of gossip about Hendrik Storm, a formidable figure whose ruthlessness was legendary in certain circles. Devereaux himself rarely spoke of him. Perhaps that was the real reason behind the near-constant tautness in his shoulders and the faint lines of strain around his eyes. "All right," she replied softly, shifting her gaze to the stage where speeches would be given. "I'll go for refined elegance, something that still feels welcoming, like you said with the new direction. Less steel and glass, more subtlety." He considered her words. "Precisely." A brief pause fell between them before he turned to face the far end of the ballroom. "We'll want the lighting to highlight the donation exhibits. And keep in mind, we'll have high-profile guests, some from the media, some potential partners." He spoke as if ticking off items on a mental list, but Evie noticed he was clenching his jaw slightly. The entire event, it seemed, carried enormous significance not just for the company, but personally for him as well. They ended up spending the next hour walking the length and breadth of the ballroom. Evie pointed out where large floral arrangements might soften the stark lines of the tall windows, how a scattering of lounge-style seating could encourage conversation rather than the stiff formality of banquet chairs. Devereaux listened intently, occasionally making a terse comment, occasionally nodding his agreement. At one point, she nearly tripped over a rolled-up carpet sample. He caught her elbow, steadying her. A fleeting warmth passed between them, and for an instant, she felt his grasp linger before he let go. Once the layout was settled, they paused near the exit. Evie expected him to pivot and disappear as he often did, but instead he stood there, hands in his pockets, an unreadable tension flitting across his face. She wondered if he was on the verge of confiding something, or if he was simply weighing how much he could trust her. Ultimately, he said nothing personal, merely nodded and began to step away. She thought the moment was lost. But just as she reached for her coat, he spoke again, his voice quieter than usual. "You handle pressure well," he remarked, gaze fixed ahead. "Most people buckle under the board's scrutiny and the constant changes. You adapt." Caught off guard, she offered a gentle laugh. "I'm not always calm inside, believe me. But I know what it's like to build something from the ground up." She hesitated, then continued, "My parents run a small cafe. If they hadn't learned to adapt to every crisis, breaking equipment, last-minute staffing, they wouldn't have made it. I guess I learned from them that if something doesn't work, you change strategies, not your core values." He studied her in silence, and for a heartbeat she thought she noticed a flicker of something akin to longing in his eyes. Then, just as quickly, his expression schooled back to an even calm. "That's a good principle," he murmured, sounding almost reluctant to admit it. "Keep applying it here." Before she could respond, he inclined his head and strode out, leaving the cavernous room more silent than before. Evie was left mulling over every word, every tiny shift in his demeanor. She wondered if she'd glimpsed the slightest crack in the fortress of his composure, or if she was simply imagining it. Either way, the memory of his hand on her elbow, the quiet sincerity in that final comment, lingered in her thoughts. That night, she returned to her apartment, parted her curtains, and gazed at the sprawling city lights. She tried to remind herself that her job was design, not psychoanalysis. Yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt, an almost gravitational tug to understand the man who epitomized success yet moved through life as though trust were a luxury he could never afford. Maybe she was out of her depth. Maybe she should keep her head down, meet her deadlines, and do nothing more. But a deeper part of her couldn't resist the mystery that was Devereaux Storm, nor could she shake the feeling that no matter how hard he fought to remain cold and distant, something in him was stirring every time their paths crossed. By the time the date of the charity gala drew closer, Evie had plunged into an unrelenting schedule of final touches and last-minute fixes. She oversaw the floral team's arrangements, double-checked that the lighting setup complemented her carefully chosen color scheme, and made sure every sign, banner, and table centerpiece aligned with the new image that Storm and Company wanted to present. Despite the flurry of activity around her, she found her thoughts frequently drifting to Devereaux Storm himself. His name was on everyone's lips, executives, PR managers, even the caterers who wondered if he would approve the chosen menu, yet he maintained a spectral presence, rarely offering more than a few sharp directives at staff meetings. Sometimes she sensed the stress rolling off him in waves, though no one else seemed bold enough to comment on it. 2 days before the event, Evie received an unexpected summons to Devereaux's office. She'd only been there once before to deliver a set of revised design proposals. The space was every bit as imposing as the man, floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the Manhattan skyline, a sleek black desk meticulously free of clutter, and a single abstract painting in muted colors that felt oddly lonely against the stark walls. This time, when she walked in, she found Devereaux standing behind his desk with his arms crossed, speaking with his father, Hendrik Storm. She recognized the elder Storm's face from financial magazines, a hard-lined man whose presence seemed even more intimidating up close. Hendricks offered her a stiff nod but directed most of his attention at his son. Devereaux, Hendricks was saying, the guest list must be impeccable. If we're aiming to negotiate new deals at this gala, we need the right people to see that Storm and Company is thriving under your leadership. I expect no distractions. You've kept a tight ship so far, maintain it. Devereaux's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. I'm aware, father. Everything is under control. Hendricks's gaze flicked to Evie, as if assessing whether she posed any threat or interruption. When he finally walked out, the tension in the room seemed to ease by a fraction. Devereaux exhaled, gesturing for Evie to come closer. She approached the desk, noticing an open folder containing lists of VIPs and corporate sponsors. He pointed to the pages. I need your help to confirm that the decor complements these highlight areas. My father wants specific corners of the ballroom emphasized, areas where investors and board members will congregate. I know you had your own vision for a more open, fluid space, but there might be last-minute adjustments. Evie held back a sigh. She had spent hours ensuring the decor wouldn't feel segmented or cliquish. Still, she understood Storm and Company was juggling serious deals. Let me know exactly which spots need extra focus, she said, keeping her tone cordial. I'll see if we can adjust the layout without losing the overall look. He slid the folder toward her. I appreciate it. Then he paused, gray eyes skating over her carefully. You've done more than expected already. The praise from the board has been notable. But I won't let them take advantage of you. She blinked, uncertain if this was meant to be reassurance. I'm grateful for the opportunities. Really, it's nothing I can't handle. That answer seemed to satisfy him on the surface, but she sensed he was holding something back. The lines of his face were taut as if he was wrestling with a decision. Before she could probe further, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He picked up, and Evie seized the moment to gather her folder and slip out, cheeks warm from the intensity of his gaze. In the corridor, she nearly collided with a tall woman wearing a fitted designer dress, Aurelia Royce, if Evie recalled correctly, a high society figure rumored to be the daughter of one of Storm and Company's major international partners. Aurelia paused, looking Evie up and down with a glance that radiated mild condescension. Oh, she said, smooth voice laced with an aloof tone, you must be the interior designer. I was hoping to see Devereaux, but he's on a call, I take it. Evie murmured a polite yes, stepping aside as Aurelia swept past with a confidence that spoke volumes about her familiarity with this environment. Something about the woman's knowing smirk made Evie's stomach tighten. Just as Aurelia vanished into Devereaux's office, Evie spotted the door closing behind her. Part of her wondered if Aurelia's presence posed more than just a casual business relationship. The possibility left an unsettled pang in her chest, though she told herself she had no right to feel possessive. Her connection to Devereaux was purely professional, wasn't it? 2 nights later, the gala arrived in a blaze of city lights. Limousines and luxury cars lined the curb outside the venue, their well-dressed occupants stepping onto a plush red carpet leading into the grand ballroom. Evie stood near the entrance, checking that each detail matched her vision, tall white columns adorned with subtle gold leaves, clusters of tasteful centerpieces, and strategic uplighting that made the space glow softly. By all appearances, her efforts had paid off, the place looked dazzling yet inviting, and the guests murmured their approval as they wandered between art displays and donation booths. Still, beneath the satisfaction, she was unusually nervous. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, a far cry from the glitzy gowns many attendees flaunted, and tried to blend in so she could observe the flow of the event. Standing discreetly by a marble pillar, she watched Devereaux move through the crowd, greeting board members, shaking hands with potential investors, his every gesture exuding poised authority. He looked at ease in the swirl of mingling, yet the faint tightness around his eyes suggested the pressure he was under. Out of the corner of her eye, Evie noticed Aurelia Royce once more, gliding through the ballroom and eventually attaching herself to Devereaux's side. They exchanged a few words, and Aurelia laughed, leaning in with a familiarity that made something twist in Evie's gut. It was none of her business, she reminded herself. Devereaux Storm had the right to keep company with whomever he pleased. Pushing aside the pang of jealousy, she focused on ensuring the lighting was flawlessly set for the upcoming speeches. After making a final pass around the stage, she stepped behind the curtains to consult with the AV team. That was when she heard low voices carrying from the other side of a partition. She paused, realizing it was Devereaux and Hendrik Storm speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "This is our chance to cement the new partnership," Hendricks was saying. "And if that means entertaining the idea of a match with Aurelia Royce, so be it. Her father's capital could be invaluable for future expansions. You know how these circles work, marriages have sealed bigger deals than this." A cold prickle swept through Evie's veins at the notion of a marriage for business. She didn't move, heart pounding, as she heard Devereaux's clipped response. "I'm not bartering my personal life for the company. That era is over." His tone brooked no argument. Hendricks, however, snorted disdainfully. "You think you can afford scruples right now? We're on the brink of the biggest acquisition in our history. Don't let a silly infatuation cloud your judgment." Another pause, as though he sensed resistance. "And I've noticed you spending a great deal of time with that designer. Don't tell me you're letting yourself be distracted by a nobody." Evie's stomach sank. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle any sound, mortified to be eavesdropping. Yet she couldn't tear herself away. The silence that followed felt charged, as though Devereaux was struggling to remain calm. "My relationships are not your concern," came Devereaux's eventually measured reply. "And Evangeline Carter is hardly a nobody, she's elevated this entire event." His voice flared with a hint of anger, then softened into something more controlled. "I will finalize deals on my own terms." The hush that followed crackled with tension. At last, Hendricks gave a dismissive sigh. "We'll see, Devereaux. Just don't let your misguided sense of independence ruin what we've built. Even you can't deny the company might be better served by the right alliances." Footsteps signaled his departure. Evie remained hidden, heart pounding. She had never felt so conflicted, gratitude that Devereaux had defended her, horror at hearing how his father viewed her. A swirl of emotion, half confusion, half heartbreak, churned in her chest. She forced herself to exhale slowly, steadying her thoughts. Maybe it was naive, but she'd imagined that beneath his icy surface, Devereaux felt some growing kinship with her, something that might transcend their roles. Now, it was painfully clear that his father believed otherwise. And who knew how much Devereaux actually valued her beyond professional respect? Later that night, the speeches concluded without a hitch. Devereaux took the stage, delivering a concise but compelling address about Storm and Company's philanthropic goals and business vision. Applause erupted, and behind the scenes, Evie felt both proud and strangely hollow. She hadn't realized just how much she'd allowed a personal desire to mingle with her professional ambitions. Perhaps that made her a fool. Maybe she should return to Seabright once the redesign project wrapped, carrying the success in her portfolio and leaving the confusion of Devereaux Storm far behind. As the crowd began to disperse, she busied herself collecting leftover programs and confirming final details with the event's coordinator. She'd almost managed to avoid running into Devereaux in the aftermath, but fate intervened. He caught her by the elevator just as she was about to slip away. Without preamble, he said, "The place looked incredible. You brought exactly what I wanted to this event." "Thank you." She forced a small smile. "I'm just glad I could help Storm and Company make a good impression." His gaze flickered with something unspoken, as though he sensed her abrupt distance. "Are you all right?" He hesitated, then added, "You seem quieter than usual." She wanted to tell him she knew what his father had said, that Aurelia was waiting somewhere in the crowd, that she felt overshadowed by a world of alliances and deals that had no room for genuine emotion. But all she managed was a polite shake of her head. "I'm fine, just tired." He studied her, jaw tensing, but didn't push it. The elevator doors slid open. She stepped inside, casting one last glance at the gilded ballroom behind them. For a second, she thought he might follow her, but he stayed on the threshold, hands at his sides. An unspoken question lingered between them, weighted by the chill of corporate obligations and the subtle flame of something more personal. When the doors shut, her chest tightened as if she'd lost an opportunity to confide in him or let him confide in her. Instead, she descended alone, the humming elevator a stark reminder of the barriers between them. She told herself she was no stranger to challenges, she had built a career from scratch and faced countless skepticisms. But this, the matter of Devereaux Storm's guarded heart and his father's ambitions, was a battle she wasn't sure she had any right to fight. Emerging onto the sidewalk, she breathed in the cool night air, brushing away the sting in her eyes. She remembered how earnestly her father back home had once told her, "When you do what you love, obstacles become fuel to keep going." Yet in that moment, exhaustion and uncertainty made her question whether love or genuine connection had any place in a realm as ruthless as Storm and Company. Maybe Devereaux was right to insulate himself behind cynicism. Maybe romance was doomed in this empire of power brokers and strategic pairings. Clutching her shawl tighter, she walked away from the glittering venue lights, wishing the success of the evening didn't feel quite so hollow. If only she could peel back Devereaux's carefully constructed armor, discover the man beneath his father's relentless influence, and see if their tenuous bond had any real chance. But as the city lights gleamed overhead, she realized that might be a dream as distant as the stars, too fragile to survive in the cutthroat world of billionaires who swore they would never risk their heart's point. 2 days after the gala, Evie arrived at Storm and Company headquarters convinced that it was time to wrap up the project and remove herself from the silent tensions she could no longer ignore. The event had been a triumph by most measures, media coverage was glowing, the board praised her tasteful design, and several new business leads emerged. Yet Evie herself felt strangely adrift, haunted by what she had overheard between Devereaux and his father. She couldn't shake the image of the elder Storm, his derisive tone calling her a nobody, and hinting at the possibility of an arranged alliance between Devereaux and Aurelia Royce. That morning, she entered the building through a side entrance, hoping to avoid unwanted attention. The plan was to finalize a few last design details, collect her materials, and quietly inform the team she would be returning to Seabright sooner than expected. Let them believe she simply had other engagements, there was no sense stirring gossip about her personal reasons for leaving. Yet the moment she stepped off the elevator on the design floor, she realized her plan for a discreet exit was futile. A cluster of staff members bustled around, whispering about some kind of crisis. One of them, an assistant manager named Florence, caught sight of Evie and hurried over with a grim expression. "Ms. Carter, thank goodness you're here," Florence said, voice taut. "We just got word that Mr. Hendrik Storm is demanding a full audit of all design-related expenditures. Apparently there are concerns about overspending, especially on the charity gala's aesthetic changes." Evie's stomach knotted. She couldn't recall any extravagance that hadn't been pre-approved, and the project's budget had remained well within the upper limit set by Devereaux and the board. Even so, an audit implied suspicion, and suspicion could tarnish her reputation. I see. Has anyone explained that I worked within the authorized proposals? Florence nodded. Yes, but Mr. Storm insists on seeing every invoice. He's implying there might have been improprieties. She lowered her voice. Some staffers say he's using this as leverage against Mr. Devereaux, stirring trouble to regain a tighter grip on the company. Evie set her jaw, anger flaring beneath her initial worry. Of course. Hendrik Storm wasn't above creating chaos if it served his agenda, especially if he believed Devereaux was drifting from the path he'd laid out. And Evie, apparently, had become a convenient scapegoat. She spent the next few hours sifting through receipts and itemized bills, meticulously documenting every paint can, floral arrangement, and fabric swatch. When she noticed a pair of visitors from the company's legal department lurking in the hallway, it hit her just how serious the situation was. Even if the accusations were baseless, the stress alone could sabotage her standing in a city where design contracts hinged on flawless reputations. By noon, she took a break and wandered toward the rarely used lounge area at the end of the corridor, a quiet spot with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the busy streets below. She leaned on the windowsill, letting her eyes drift over the skyline. Everything about the day felt surreal, as though she were stumbling into someone else's corporate drama. She had come here to design interiors, not get entangled in a power struggle. A voice behind her made her stiffen. Hiding from the storm. She turned to see Devereaux, hands in his pockets, expression guarded. He stepped closer, the tension in his features mirroring her own unease. I heard about my father's audit, he said gravely. I'm sorry. This never should have touched you. Evie gave a humorless laugh. Well, it has. And if he's so determined to find wrongdoing, I'm not sure I can stop him. Paperwork might not be enough to satisfy a man bent on making a point. She swallowed, forcing her voice to remain steady. You realize this could ruin my studio's credibility if he stirs doubt, even if I'm completely innocent. He exhaled, jaw tight. I won't let that happen. I'm already gathering proof that the board signed off on every line item. My father has no factual basis, only bluster. His tone warmed for an instant. Believe me, Evie, I won't let him tear you down to get to me. She studied him, torn between gratitude and fear. Despite her anger at his father, she couldn't ignore that Devereaux's gaze radiated genuine concern. The memory of overhearing him defend her to Hendrik Storm replayed in her mind. Thank you, she managed, her voice softening. But you shouldn't have to fight your father for my sake. Maybe it's better if I just leave early. After all, I've accomplished what I was hired to do. His expression hardened. I never asked you to run, he said, a hint of frustration breaking through his polished calm. And I don't want you to. You've put your skill and creativity into this project, and it's elevated Storm and Company beyond my expectations. You deserve to see it through without fear of backlash. Her eyes stung, emotion welling. She ached to tell him everything, about how she'd overheard the talk of Aurelia Royce, about how painful it was to believe she might be just another pawn in a world where alliances and money overshadowed genuine connection. But she bit her tongue, uncertain whether it was wise to bare her vulnerability. This place isn't exactly friendly ground for me anymore, she said gently, glancing at the bustle of staffers scurrying past the glass walls of the lounge. Your father's made that clear. Devereaux's voice dropped. My father and I have never agreed on what's important. He sees the world as a set of transactions, marriages, deals, even family relationships. He doesn't realize that I intend to carve my own path. A beat of silence passed between them, charged with unspoken confessions. Evie felt the pull of that moment, a shared recognition of how their lives had intersected in ways neither had anticipated. Then footsteps approached from the corridor, and the moment broke. Devereaux composed his features into a detached calm, as though sliding back into the armor he always wore. She followed suit, bracing herself as a pair of junior executives approached with anxious expressions and a flurry of budget-related questions. For the rest of the afternoon, Devereaux and Evie worked side by side in a small conference room, assembling an airtight case to refute Hendrik Storm's audit demands. Page after page of spreadsheets were scrutinized, each number cross-checked with official approvals. Their dynamic was focused, professional, yet beneath the flurry of data, she felt an unspoken closeness born of adversity. He was no longer the aloof billionaire who questioned her every design choice, she was no longer simply the outsider with big ideas. They were partners in defending the integrity of a project that had come to mean more to both of them than they'd ever planned. Near dusk, when Evie's eyes were dry from studying countless digital invoices, Devereaux suggested they take a quick break. They stepped out for fresh air on a small terrace normally reserved for employees' coffee breaks. The city sprawled beneath them in fading amber light. She leaned against the railing, exhaustion pressing on her limbs. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Not just for helping, but for caring whether or not this destroys me." His voice, low and thoughtful, answered, "You're worth more than just your contributions here, Evie. My father doesn't see it, but that's his failing, not yours." She turned her head, studying his profile. The last rays of sun streaked across his face, highlighting the shadows beneath his eyes. She realized he'd rarely looked this unguarded, even with her. "I overheard him after the gala," she admitted, bracing herself for his reaction. "He wants you tied to Aurelia Royce, or some other strategic marriage that benefits the company. He called me a nobody." His expression darkened, though not with surprise. "I'm sorry you heard that. I tried to shield you from it." Her heart twisted with conflicting emotions. "I'm not sure if it's me you wanted to shield, or yourself," she said, and the sting of tears crept into her voice before she could stop it. "Because I get it, love is messy, vulnerability is risky. Your father's taught you that everything is a transaction." Devereaux met her gaze, something like regret flickering in his eyes. "If that's what you think I believe, you're mistaken. I've seen the damage that comes from loveless deals. That's exactly why I swore I'd never let myself fall into those traps." She swallowed, the ache in her chest intensifying. "So you built these walls around your heart, convincing yourself it's safer. But if you lock everyone out, doesn't that mean you're just alone?" For a long moment, he said nothing, the city's din filling the silence. Then his hand drifted to hers, hovering there as though he feared crossing the last boundary of caution he'd set for himself. When his fingers finally closed around hers, his grip was warm and unsteady. "I've been alone for a long time," he murmured. "But being near you, it's different. I hate that it exposes us to my father's machinations. I hate that he can use you as a target. But I can't," he broke off, gaze dropping to where their hands intertwined. She breathed out, heart pounding. This was dangerous territory, admitting feelings that had no neat category in the corporate universe he inhabited. And yet in that hushed twilight, standing side by side on a terrace above the city, she felt as though they stood on a cusp of something genuine. A rap on the terrace door jolted them back to reality. A junior executive peered out apologetically, telling Devereaux there was an urgent phone call from the legal department. He sighed, releasing Evie's hand. The vulnerability in his eyes retreated behind a mask of composure. "Go," she whispered, steeling herself. "We'll finish this tomorrow." He hesitated, then nodded and slipped inside, leaving her alone with the rush of wind. She leaned against the railing, mind buzzing with every word and every quiet admission. No matter how forcefully Hendrik Storm tried to pit them against each other, she realized the lines between her work and her emotions had become irrevocably blurred. For better or worse, Devereaux Storm was no longer just a client or an aloof billionaire. He was a man caught between the obligations of empire and a longing for something real. What that meant for them both, Evie had no idea. But as the last of the sun's glow faded from the sky, she recognized that her part in this story was far from over, even if the risks made her heart pound in both fear and a peculiar, undeniable hope. The next day dawned with a subdued calm that felt like the eye of a hurricane. Evie arrived at the office clutching her bag of design swatches and printouts, reminding herself to stay composed even if everything around her seemed on the verge of crumbling. The mood in the halls of Storm and Company was tense, employees murmuring anxiously about rumors of an impending shakeup at the highest levels. No one dared to speak Hendrik Storm's name too loudly, but everyone knew his audit demands were still hanging over the design department like a thundercloud. Mid-morning, Devereaux requested that she meet him in one of the smaller conference rooms tucked away on a less trafficked floor. She found him there pacing behind a sleek glass table, sleeves rolled up in an uncharacteristic display of informal agitation. She set her bag down, bracing herself for whatever new revelation might come. He didn't waste time with small talk. "My father's decided to escalate," he said, voice taut with anger. "He's calling for an emergency board meeting this afternoon, claiming irregularities in certain budgets, including yours. It's absurd, none of the numbers match his accusations, but he's determined to push the narrative that the project is rife with overspending." Evie fought down a surge of panic. "Can we present the evidence we gathered? We have all the receipts, plus the approvals from the board members themselves. Isn't that enough to shut him down?" Devereaux raked a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd rarely seen him allow. "Normally, yes. But this is about power. He wants to undermine me, question my judgment in hiring decisions, and," he hesitated, voice lowering. "He wants me to bend to his will. If I bow now and agree to his so-called, better alliances, he might withdraw the audit." She felt a jolt of indignation, recalling the conversation she'd overheard about a potential marriage alliance. "He's using your personal life as leverage, hoping you'll sacrifice whatever you've started to care about." His gaze flicked to her, that barely contained frustration burning in his eyes. "Yes. And I refused, which only hardens his resolve." They spent the next hour reviewing every financial statement yet again, each transaction meticulously outlined. The legal team popped in twice, nodding approvingly at the organization of the data but warning that Hendrik Storm might spin any technical ambiguity to his advantage. By the time lunchtime arrived, Evie's head ached with so many numbers, but the real ache came from the fear of what might happen if Hendrik succeeded in framing her design work as a liability. Around 1 in the afternoon, Devereaux announced they had to go upstairs for the emergency board meeting. She balked at the idea of entering a room full of executives, some of whom might side with Hendricks, but Devereaux insisted she be there to answer any design-related questions directly. So they walked side by side down the corridor, past staffers who offered worried glances, until they reached the elegant double doors leading to the main boardroom. Inside, the atmosphere felt colder than ever. Tall windows let in daylight that cast stark shadows across the polished wood table. Hendrik Storm sat near the head, speaking quietly with an older board member. Aurelia Royce was also present, a small detail that struck Evie like a punch to the gut. Why would Aurelia be there? Possibly as a representative of her family's investment interests, or perhaps simply to observe a potential scandal. Devereaux guided Evie to a pair of empty seats, then took his place at the table's head. The conversation began with formalities, reports on quarterly earnings, an update on a tech partnership, none of which alleviated the mounting tension. At last, Hendricks cleared his throat, eyes gleaming as he launched into his critique. He brandished a sheaf of papers that Evie recognized as manipulated excerpts from the project's invoices. "This report," he proclaimed, "shows cost overruns that deviate from the original scope by a concerning margin. Without thorough vetting, these expenditures could signal financial irresponsibility, if not outright misconduct." Evie tensed, hand gripping the edge of her chair. She was desperate to speak, but Devereaux lifted a hand, silently indicating she should wait. Calmly, he asked, "Which line items specifically concern you?" Hendricks's lips curved in a predatory smile. The gala decor cost nearly 30% above the initial estimates, for one. And certain materials in the corporate redesign appear to be more luxurious than what was first budgeted. At that, Devereaux nodded to Evie. She stood, nerves roiling in her stomach. Speaking as confidently as she could manage, she explained that extra materials had been approved by the board to ensure the event's success and to align with the newly acquired subsidiary's brand integration. She read off a list of signed approvals from senior executives, documents that clearly authorized the expenses in question. One of the board members frowned and asked for clarification. Another shuffled papers, finding the relevant signatures. Murmurs of confusion arose, puncturing Hendrik Storm's accusation. Evie felt a flicker of relief as they realized she wasn't at fault. But Hendrix wasn't finished. He tapped a finger on another page. But these floral arrangements, did we truly need such extravagance? Surely you could have achieved the same effect for half the price. One might wonder if Carter's interiors profited from a markup. The insinuation stung. Evie inhaled sharply, meeting his gaze. I used a reputable florist, one who offered us a discount rate due to our large order. There was no markup, Mr. Storm. The receipts are all documented. It was a strategic decision to create a particular ambience. And we did, in fact, come in under costs quoted by 2 other vendors. A few board members exchanged questioning glances, clearly not convinced by Hendrix's attempt to paint her as profiteering. Emboldened by that reaction, she continued in a measured tone, the gala's success brought in new investor interest, as I'm sure you've seen in the media coverage. The net gain from those partnerships far outweighs any minor increases in decor spending. A nervous hush fell, punctuated by the rustle of papers. Then one of the board members leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. I can't find any real discrepancy here, Hendrix. Maybe your concerns were a bit premature. Hendrik Storm's face darkened, but he refused to back down. Premature or not, it's our duty to ensure accountability. I'm looking out for Storm and Company's best interests, even if my son chooses a more cavalier approach. Devereaux's expression hardened. What you call cavalier, I call forward-thinking. Hiring Evangeline Carter was my decision, and her work has undeniably improved our brand image. If any board member believes differently, let them say so. No one did. The silence spoke volumes. Even Aurelia Royce appeared uncertain, glancing between Hendrix and the rest of the room. Eventually, the board chairman cleared his throat, declaring there was no cause to continue an audit unless new evidence arose. Hendrix's shoulders tensed, but he forced a tight smile and muttered something about appreciating diligence. The meeting ended with a forced sense of order, tension coiled beneath the surface. Relief coursed through Evie as she gathered her papers, though her legs trembled from the adrenaline crash. Several executives murmured compliments about her thorough documentation. She thanked them, her gaze drifting to Devereaux, whose face remained composed despite the upheaval they'd just endured. Hendrik stormed out, a clear sign that the confrontation was far from over, but at least for now she wasn't the scapegoat. In the corridor, she let out a shaky exhale. Devereaux caught up to her, and without a word, placed a gentle hand on her arm. She glanced up, struggling to form a coherent sentence, but found herself blinking back tears of sheer relief. They stood there in the hallway, a dozen people milling about, yet in that moment it felt like only the 2 of them existed. I'm sorry you had to face that, he said quietly, guiding her into a quieter nook by the windows. But you handled it better than most seasoned executives would. She tried to laugh, the sound emerging as a soft, hollow chuckle. I've never been so terrified in my life. But I refuse to let him twist my work into something unethical. He nodded, eyes reflecting a flicker of gratitude or admiration, she wasn't sure which. Thank you for standing your ground. His voice lowered, becoming more personal. It means more to me than I can say. A warmth flooded her chest, momentarily overshadowing her exhaustion. She realized that everything, her decision to come here, to fight for her design, to resist backing down, had led to a fragile understanding between them. Even if he was a billionaire enveloped by a world of deals and demands, she saw something in him that defied his father's cynicism. She saw a man who had chosen to defend her, not merely because it was good business, but because he cared. Before either of them could speak further, Aurelia Royce's voice sliced through the air. "Devereaux." She approached, heel clicks echoing on the polished floor. "Can we speak for a moment, privately?" Her gaze flicked disdainfully to Evie, who instinctively straightened her posture. Devereaux, tense again, cast Evie a brief apologetic look. "Give me a minute, please," he asked softly, then turned to Aurelia, the walls of composure snapping back into place. Evie nodded and stepped away, senses reeling. She found an empty bench near the window, forcing herself not to watch as Aurelia led Devereaux aside, too far away for Evie to make out their conversation. The sight still stung, especially after overhearing the possibility of a strategic match. Minutes dragged on. She could sense the weight of her uncertain future, the conflicting realities of Devereaux's life. Even as her heart swelled with the knowledge that he'd taken her side against his father, she had no illusions about the looming threats. Hendrik's storm wasn't done, and Aurelia might still hold a key to alliances Devereaux's father deemed vital. Eventually, Aurelia walked off, her elegant figure disappearing around a corner. Devereaux returned, tension radiating from every step. His eyes met Evie's, flickering with silent regret. She pushed down the questions swirling in her mind, managing a tentative smile. For now, they had won a small victory, her credibility was intact, the audit diffused. Yet the deeper fault lines in Storm and Company remained unresolved. "We should get some air," Devereaux said, offering his arm. "Perhaps a coffee run, away from prying eyes." The simplicity of that suggestion tugged at her heart. She rose and followed him, knowing that this respite was only temporary. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself the faintest hope that maybe they could build something real in the midst of the family empire's storm. Even if the next trial was already gathering on the horizon, she would face it by his side, bound by more than a mere design contract. Evie had been in New York long enough to sense the city settling into its late spring rhythm, cool mornings turning into brisk afternoons, the streets bright with fresh blossoms and the promise of new beginnings. But even as sunshine spilled across Storm and Company's glass facade, a simmering tension remained. Whispers about Hendrik Storm's maneuvers refused to die down, and there was no telling when he might launch another offensive to regain control. Meanwhile, Devereaux navigated back-to-back meetings and PR obligations, his brow often furrowed with an invisible weight. She and Devereaux continued to share moments of stolen calm, a brief pause in a conference room to compare design updates, a quiet coffee break on the terrace where they would talk about everything and nothing. He never fully let his guard down, but each day offered some small gesture that proved his intentions were genuine, a soft question about her family's cafe, a tension-easing smile when their eyes met across a crowded executive suite. They hadn't labeled the undercurrent that coursed between them, but neither could ignore the pull. Whenever he was near, Evie felt the rest of the building slip away, as though nothing mattered except the unspoken link growing stronger between them. Then, in a single whirlwind week, everything collided at once. One morning, a discreet email dropped into Evie's inbox, an invitation to a high-level corporate reception in Devereaux's personal penthouse. She reread the details, pulse speeding. It was not an event for the entire staff, just a select group of executives and investors, presumably including Hendrik Storm. The subject line read, in Devereaux's understated style, a private gathering to discuss the future of Storm and Company. Despite the formal language, Evie couldn't shake the feeling this might be something more significant, a moment that could redefine not only the company's direction but also their own uncertain relationship. When she arrived at the penthouse that evening, a hush of anticipation greeted her. The double doors opened into a sprawling, tastefully furnished living space. Expanses of glass revealed the glittering city lights, and the interior design, though masculine and modern, lacked the icy sterility she might have expected. Subtle art pieces punctuated the white walls, and the scent of eucalyptus hinted at Devereaux's newly discovered penchant for warmth in a space. A handful of polished executives mingled by a sleek bar, swirling drinks while speaking in hushed tones. Evie's heart kicked at the sight of Aurelia Royce perched on a velvet settee, chatting with a cluster of board members. Across the room stood Hendrik Storm, his posture stiff, gaze raking over the penthouse like a hawk in foreign territory. Devereaux appeared from a side hallway. He was dressed in a crisp navy suit that highlighted his dark hair and sharp features. When he spotted Evie, he immediately excused himself from a conversation and approached, an almost imperceptible softness lightening his usually steeled eyes. "You came," he said quietly, as though relieved. "I wasn't sure if you'd accept." She offered a small, wry smile, nerves fluttering. "I wasn't sure if I should, but, here I am." He seemed about to respond when Hendrik Storm's booming voice cut through the gathering. "Shall we begin? We're all eager to hear what this future of Storm and Company might entail, son." People gravitated toward a cleared area in the center of the penthouse, where a slim podium stood, presumably brought in for the occasion. Evie moved off to the side, not wanting to distract from the corporate discussions. Yet the moment Devereaux stepped up to the podium, she felt an odd surge of pride. He looked every inch the poised leader, though she caught the slight set of his jaw, a sign he was bracing for what he had to say. He kept his remarks concise, addressing the achievements of recent months, expanded partnerships, new lines of business, and yes, the design overhaul that had modernized Storm and Company's corporate image. He acknowledged the friction with his father, Hendrix, in measured phrases, attributing it to a generational divide on how to seize upcoming opportunities. Then, to everyone's surprise, he outlined a fresh strategy that shifted focus from pure acquisitions to innovations, investments in technology, more flexible corporate structures, and philanthropic initiatives that would deepen Storm and Company's community impact. Evie recognized the influence of their late-night conversations, when he'd confessed he wanted the company to stand for more than just power. "And so," Devereaux concluded, voice echoing against the penthouse's high ceilings, "we will move forward under a vision that respects our legacy but embraces collaboration and authenticity. Our success hinges on more than bottom-line figures, it hinges on meaning and genuine connections." A wave of murmured approval swept the room, mingled with a few uncertain glances. Hendrik Storm stood to one side, arms crossed, lips pressed in a thin line. Clearly, he didn't share Devereaux's enthusiasm for a less cutthroat future. Aurelia Royce merely arched a brow, as though calculating how such changes might affect her father's investment. Sensing the tension, Devereaux lifted his head. "I've also called this meeting to clarify something personal, since it overlaps with business concerns." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Evie felt her stomach twist. Was he about to address the speculation about Aurelia, or possibly highlight the swirling rumors about him and Evie? He glanced at his father, then at Aurelia, and finally let his gaze settle, just for a heartbeat, on Evie standing near the back. Storm and Company has always been shaped by alliances, yes, even marriages and family ties. My father and his father before him believed that forging strategic unions was paramount. But this new era should be about genuine partnership, not transactions. I won't be entertaining any arranged alliances to placate the old guard. A shocked hush descended. Evie's cheeks heated at the directness of that statement. Hendrik Storm gave a derisive snort, and Aurelia's expression flickered with annoyance. But Devereaux held firm, his calm unwavering. "So," he continued, "I'm announcing tonight that I'll retain full control of Storm and Company as CEO, focusing on collaborative growth. There won't be a forced partnership with any investor or family. This is the path I choose." It felt as if the entire room let out a collective exhale. Board members glanced among themselves, no doubt reassessing alliances, while Hendrik Storm glowered, hands tightening around a glass of whiskey. Aurelia's gaze hardened, but she managed a taut smile, as though she'd expected no less and was already strategizing her next move. Once Devereaux finished and polite applause followed, he descended from the podium and drifted through the crowd, answering pointed questions, enduring a few icy barbs from his father. Evie tried to stay inconspicuous, but she could feel the tremor in her limbs. This was a seismic shift in Storm and Company's power structure, and it might open the door to more sabotage, yet Devereaux had chosen to break from the old ways in a public, unequivocal stand. Eventually, as the discussion waned and some guests began to filter out, Devereaux made his way to Evie. Without a word, he placed a hand gently at her elbow and guided her onto a private balcony. The city stretched below, alive with shimmering lights. "Thank you for being here," he said softly, releasing a measured breath. "I needed to set the record straight." She rested her fingertips on the balcony railing, heart pounding against her ribs. "That was bold. You basically told your father and the entire board you won't marry for business. And that you'll do things your own way." He nodded, expression pensive. "I've spent too long watching how loveless deals poison everything. My mother and father, all the illusions and resentments that shaped my childhood. I won't replicate that. Not for any price." A gust of wind teased the strands of her hair, carrying the faint echo of sirens far below. She sensed the weight of his words, how they bridged the gap between corporate ambition and personal convictions. With a slight tremor in her voice, she asked the question that had haunted her for weeks. "Where does that leave me? I was brought here as just a designer, but, somewhere along the way, everything changed." He slipped closer, eyes dark with earnest emotion. "I owe you an apology for dragging you into the company's crossfire. And for letting my father cast doubt on your integrity. You deserved better. But I also owe you the truth about why I can't let you leave." She struggled to breathe. "Devereaux." His hand found hers, the same warm steadiness she'd felt in glimpses before. "You saw who I was underneath all this armor, Evie. You challenged me to be more than a cynical businessman. And I realized I wanted that chance, even if it meant defying every vow I once made never to love." Tears pricked her eyes, a surge of disbelief and hope flooding her chest. She recalled the first time she'd stepped on his expensive shoes, their countless debates over color palettes, the quiet admissions they'd shared on that terrace. "I still have my own life in Seabright," she murmured, voice trembling. "I'm nobody special in this world of billionaires and boardrooms." He shook his head. "You're Evangeline Carter, the woman who refused to compromise her values or her designs, who dared to stand up to my father and refused to let me hide behind my walls. If you think that makes you nobody, you're wrong." For a moment, the night air held them in a hush. Then, as though taking a final step across an unseen chasm, he leaned in and pressed his lips gently to hers. The city's noise slipped away. She melted into the warmth of his kiss, tears slipping down her cheeks, tears of relief, of release, of everything she'd quietly longed for since stumbling into his world. When they broke apart, breathing unsteady, she noticed a hint of vulnerability in his gaze, a rare, naked openness. She cupped his cheek, aware that a year ago, neither of them could have predicted they'd be here, on a high-rise balcony, forging a bond that defied corporate cynicism and personal fears. "So what now?" she whispered, letting a breathless laugh escape. He smiled, a real, unguarded expression that softened the planes of his face. "We face whatever comes together. We stand up to my father, show the board that Storm and Company can evolve, and if Aurelia or anyone else wants to challenge that, they can try." A new wave of laughter bubbled up in her, half joy, half astonishment. For the first time, it felt like a true partnership, free from the constraints of unspoken rules. "And I keep designing?" He chuckled, pulling her closer. "Yes, unless you decide to open a second branch of Carter's Interiors in Manhattan. I hear the real estate market is booming." She let her forehead rest against his, savoring his quiet breath, the steady thump of his heart. "I might just do that," she murmured. "As long as I have a certain billionaire who believes in me enough to make it worthwhile." His hand slid around her waist, a gentle affirmation. Beyond the balcony, the city glowed with promise, each illuminated window a testament to the endless possibilities of a place that thrived on reinvention. Later, as they rejoined the lingering guests, something in the air felt changed. Hendrik Storm watched them from across the room, lips thinning, no doubt planning his next move. Aurelia maintained her cool poise, but Evie caught the flash of resignation in her eyes, an acknowledgement that Devereaux had made his choice. The board members, likewise, sensed the turning tide. Whether they approved or not, they could hardly contest the CEO's new direction while the company's fortunes soared and the media lauded Storm and Company's revitalized brand. Evie didn't delude herself that the road ahead would be easy. There would be battles, legal, familial, and personal. The name Storm and Company had long been synonymous with power and ruthlessness, and a kinder vision would face resistance. But as the evening wound down, Devereaux slipped a hand around hers in full view of everyone. She returned his grip, resolute. Much later that night, after the final guests departed and the penthouse lights dimmed, they found themselves alone in the hush of a living room that seemed far less imposing than it had a few hours before. He looked at her, a small, content smile curving his lips. "Would you believe me," he said, voice husky with relief and adoration, "if I told you this was the first time these walls have ever felt like home?" She blinked back tears, nodding, and let him draw her into a slow, tender embrace. The hush between them spoke volumes. Whatever storms awaited them tomorrow, they had found something real in the very world that told them love was just another transaction. And for now, standing in each other's arms, they proved that even the harshest vows against love could be shattered when the right person came along, and made them break every promise.